That I didn't come here to give a speech, I came here to go to jail.
Professor Cornel West made it very clear last night why he was in Ferguson. Today, he made good on that statement after joining clergy members as they confronted officers in front of the Ferguson Police Department. West was one of 42 protesters taken into custody, according to the St. Louis Dispatch. The protest this morning took place in driving rain, which didn't seem to dampen the spirits of the crowd. At one point, a clergy member lied down in the front of the Ferguson police station inside an outline of a body drawn in chalk. Protesters were chanting "Black Lives Matter," that all lives matter. Tonight, just a few minutes ago, protesters being arrested outside a Walmart in Ferguson. And as Washington Post reporter Wesley Lowery on the scene reports, so far civil disobedience is taking place at St. Louis University, Ferguson Police Department, St. Louis City Hall, Walmart, and a fundraiser for county executive candidate Stenger, who's being hosted by Claire McCaskill. Today's demonstrations were a culmination of 4 days of civil disobedience and protests, marking 2 months since unarmed Mike Brown was shot and killed by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, who is still drawing a paycheck. In the wake of the shooting death of Vondra Myers, who was killed last week by an off-duty St. Louis police officer, police say Myers fired at the officer first. Protests have spread all over the St. Louis metro area. Over the weekends, hundreds of people marched for blocks through downtown St. Louis. There was a sit-in occupation out front of the Ferguson police station and a much larger gathering at St. Louis University, where, according to MSNBC's Tremaine Lee, more than 1,000 people showed up. For the most part, St. Louis police, the Metro Police, have kept their distance and largely avoided the kind of big confrontation we saw back in August. But amidst all this activity in what's being called Ferguson October, there's a tension, a sort of divide between the different generations of activists and protesters on the scene. And last night, in a remarkable moment during interfaith service, that division cracked open when young protesters demanded that older protesters listen to what they had to say.
Don't keep talking about the youth, but here we are. You turn your backs against the show, we ain't being heard.
They're in pain. Let them speak.
For us, this is not an academic issue. And I said this a few weeks ago, the people who want to take the time to break down racism from a philosophical level, y'all did not show up. When the tanks and the armored trucks was there, and the tear gas was there, and we was getting hit with the rubber bullets, and we said, you know what? I can't stay home for this. I can't stay home for this. They killing us. Literally, Missouri is the new Mississippi.
Joining me now, MSNBC national reporter Tremaine Lee has been covering events in Ferguson since Michael Brown's death and is down there right now. Tremaine, this weekend has seen a kind of expansion of the scope of all this. It's striking to me how much that initial protest in August focused on Ferguson, on the dynamics of Ferguson and the racial makeup of the police there. What we're seeing now is something that's overtaken the entire St. Louis metro area, it seems.
Oh, that's correct. I mean, what you saw earlier, the anchor action, the Moral Monday style protest, kind of the throwback where clergy presented themselves, they surrendered themselves to the police in the name of Mike Brown, very orderly. About 43 people were arrested. But after that, you saw groups at the Walmart. I was at City Hall earlier where they hung up banners and demanded to see the mayor. I stopped over Steve Stenger's fundraiser, people gathering, a few arrested. And so more than just what we saw in front of the police station weeks ago and on Florissant Avenue, it spread across the region in a very remarkable fashion.
Yeah, and if you're the mayor of St. Louis or you're the St. Louis police, you now understand that there is going to be no walling this off as this plays out in the future with the grand jury still deliberating about possible charges against the officer in question. This is an issue now for St. Louis Metro Police, and it's been interesting to watch the police respond tactically to the protesters in a kind of back and forth that's been playing out in numerous different confrontations. What have you gleaned from that?
I think law enforcement learned a lot from those early days, the first few days after Michael Brown was killed, when there was sheer kind of chaos on both sides. And it seemed that the police weren't sure what they were doing. The protesters were angry and just kind of unwieldy. Now you're seeing, I talked to many protesters who've spent night after night in the Shaw neighborhood where Evandra Myers was killed. And they said that those police officers in St. Louis City would stand back. Sometimes they would beat their nightsticks on their shin guards or the ground to kind of distort and distract them. And they described an ambush where they didn't even see it coming. And so the tactics that are being employed now are much different than those kind of crazy days. It's much more tactical on both sides. On the police side, they're being more tactical, not being as just random. And also the protesters have gotten more organized and more intentional about their efforts.
And I thought that the Interfaith Service last night, I believe it was, and Tef Poe spoke there. He's been a guest on this show, both when we were in Ferguson and just the other night when I was here. You know, he spoke, there is just this raw frustration, this anger, and it's a frustration directed not only at the police, not only the sort of institutions in power locally, but at a broader sort of leadership class that a lot of folks on the street in Ferguson don't feel like are serving them, are sufficiently militant and agitated over what they're seeing. I thought that moment was remarkable. You were there at the service. What was it like?
Well, I think you don't have to look too far. I mean, think of any previous civil actions with a young, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC, a young John Lewis with the Freedom Riders. They don't have much patience. When you listen to Tef Poe, you look at Tory Russell, you look at all these young emerging leaders from this movement here, and they don't have time to talk to a clergy member, a retired post office worker who's now a pastor. They say they were here 65 days. Getting fired at with rubber bullets and the tear gas. And so I talked to Tory Russell, who really delivered kind of this fiery speech last night, expletive-filled speech last night. But he said, you know what, they come down here now and try to tell us how to organize, try to tell us how to take action in the street. But we've been taking action for 65 days. They pointed to one very prominent civil rights leader who came to town trying to, offer trainings on civil disobedience and nonviolent protests. And she's getting paid for this. That frustrated him to no end. Yeah. He said he was getting calls about this right before the interfaith session last night, and he just couldn't take it anymore.
Yeah, there's some polling out that shows how wide the racial gap is in Metro St. Louis. This is polling 600 St. Louis residents. When asked if the shooting of an African-American teen by law enforcement in Ferguson, Missouri was justified, 62% of whites said it was, along with 35% of blacks. You see a 30-point margin there, and that's how palpable is that on the street there?
It's palpable in many senses. On the other hand, it's kind of an invisible line, because if you spend any time at these protests, they've grown more diverse, but you're not seeing white members of the Ferguson community out here, one way or the other. You're not seeing counter protests. Everyone is kind of at bay. The marker had been those I Love Ferguson signs, which were a clear indicator that you weren't on the side of protesters, and then you maybe were comfortable with the status quo. So it's not that you see this the dividing line between the community and the police, but it seemed that the community and the protesters, but it seemed that the white law enforcement officers seem to be, by proxy, an extension of the white community, right. And that's where you see the remaining tension.
Trymaine Lee, thank you, man.
Thank you.
All right, he called the way Bill Maher talks about Islam undeniably bigoted. Scholar and author Reza Aslan will join me live next.